So I think this question is a little tricky. And the reason why is because it says select all the values that are equivalent to this expression. Now, most of the time you see questions like this where it's asking you to simplify this expression. This isn't asking us to simplify it. I mean, we are going to simplify it, but it's asking us which expressions are equivalent. So what that means, and I'll show you this when we get to the answers, but there's an answer to this that is not in its simplest form, which I don't really like having answers that aren't simplified, but that's what they did in this question. Okay, so whenever you're dealing with square roots, I tell my students to make a list on their paper of all the perfect squares so that you can just quickly look at them. These numbers came from just taking the numbers 1 through 11. You could do more numbers if you wanted, but that's probably good enough. And then squaring each of those numbers. So multiplying them times themselves. So 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 16, so on. And that gives me the numbers that are perfect squares. So perfect squares, what that means is if I take any of these numbers, so let's take 81, and I take the square root of 81, it's equal to 9. It's equal to a whole number. Now, numbers that are not perfect squares. So if you look at my list, all the numbers in between here are not perfect squares. And those numbers, when you take the square root of them, you get a long decimal number. You get an irrational number. Okay, so these numbers, when you take the square root of them, you get a whole number. And we call those perfect squares. And it's nice to just have them written down so you can look at them and not have to think about what they are. So what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to try to simplify this, and the first thing I like to do is I like to see 24 and 8, do they have any factors that are perfect squares? So 8, I could break into 4 is a perfect square, so I could change it into 4 times 2. All right. And then 24, I could break that into 4 times 6 because 4 is a perfect square. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take the square root of, let me just write down the question. So I have the square root of 24 over the square root of 8. And when you're simplifying, what you're trying to do is pull out any perfect squares, pull out any whole numbers that you can get out of the radical. So I'm going to break these up. So we said that 4 was a perfect square. So I'm going to change the 24 to 4 times 6. And then you'll see in a minute what I'm going to do with that. And the 8, likewise, I'm going to break that into 4 times 2. So the square root of 4 is a perfect square, so I can bring that out. Square root of 4 is 2, so that would become 2 square root of 6. And then square root of 4 is 2 in the denominator, so I can bring that out. And I have 2 square root of 2. Okay? 2 over 2 is going to cancel out. And so 2 over 2, that would be 1. It goes away. And then square root of 6 of the square root of 2. Since they're both radicals, I can divide those numbers. And so the 2's would cancel out. Right? 2 over 2 is 1. And the square root of 6 over the square root of 2 would simplify to the square root of 3. So that's the simplified form of this expression. All right? So the answer is A, and I think most people would get A correct. The problem is there's another correct answer down here, which is D. And if you look back right here, we had answer D. But answer D simplifies to the square root of 3. So this is why I don't really like this question, because one of the answers is an unsimplified form. But it didn't say to simplify it. It just said find all the values that are equivalent or equal to that. And this is equivalent. You can see I got an equal sign here. They're equivalent. So that is a correct answer. B, square root of 3 is not in the denominator, so that's no good. Square root of 16, no, that's square root of 16, by the way, that's a perfect square. That would just simplify to 4. And then E, you've got a 4 that got factored out, and we have no 4 factored out, so that's not any good either. So hopefully that helped you out. Keep it up, and you will master the math.